What do you think of when you hear the phrase Canadian military? Some people picture peacekeepers in blue helmets. Others see images of soldiers in freezing northern terrain fighting against harsh weather. Many recall Canada's role in World War I and II. Still others focus on the country's membership in NATO and NORAD. But is the Canadian military's reputation larger than its actual capabilities? Or does it receive too little credit? In today's discussion, we'll explore this question in plain English. We'll look at the structure, budget, and missions of the Canadian Forces. We'll also dig into their historical background, strategic priorities, and the public perception that shapes their image. By the end, I hope you'll have a clearer idea of whether Canada's military stands as an overrated or underrated force. And if you find yourself asking, is this even the right question, then buckle up, because we're about to explore that as well. Let's begin with a bit of context. Canada's military has origins tied to the British and French colonial forces that once fought on Canadian soil. Those early conflicts shaped the nation's defence mindset. They also led to the eventual formation of a distinct Canadian military identity. That identity would become clear when Canada took part in global wars. During World War I, Canada was still part of the British Empire, yet the Canadian Expeditionary Force fought in key battles, including Vimy Ridge. Many historians see the success at Vimy Ridge as a milestone that helped Canada forge a sense of national pride. By the end of World War I, over 600,000 Canadians served, a staggering number for a population that was below 10 million. The sacrifice was huge, with more than 60,000 killed and far more injured. World War II saw Canada once again at war alongside the Allied powers. The country had one of the largest navies in the world by the end of the conflict. Its air force was also significant for a nation of Canada's size. Canadian troops took part in the invasion of Normandy on D-Day. They fought with distinction in places like the Battle of the Atlantic and the Italian Campaign. By 1945, Canada had moved far beyond its reputation as just a small northern neighbour of the United States. After World War II, Canada joined NATO as a founding member. The onset of the Cold War meant a new geopolitical reality. Canada hosted distant early warning systems in its Arctic regions, watching for Soviet bombers that might appear over the pole. The country's proximity to the Soviet Union from the north was a unique strategic concern. In the decades that followed, Canada built a reputation as a champion of peacekeeping. Canadian peacekeepers served in places like Cyprus, Cambodia, and the Balkans. This helped create an image of Canada as a calm, level-headed actor on the world stage. The word peacekeeping itself became central to how many Canadians saw their own military. Lester B. Pearson, a Canadian Prime Minister, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957 for his role in creating the first large-scale United Nations peacekeeping mission during the Suez Crisis. The 9/11 attacks changed priorities for NATO members, including Canada. Canadian troops deployed to Afghanistan as part of the international coalition. They took on combat roles in the Kandahar region, an area known for intense fighting. Their involvement there marked a shift from the earlier peacekeeping focus. It reminded everyone that the Canadian forces, while relatively small, could still punch above their weight. Through these different eras, Canada's military shaped its identity. A force ready to answer calls for collective defence, but also a peace-loving nation that would rather not use force unless it must. That dual identity has led to conflicting ideas about Canada's military might. Some say Canada's forces remain overshadowed by the past. Others see them as overlooked. And some ask, does the Canadian military's peacekeeping legacy inflate its reputation in ways that don't match the realities of modern warfare? To assess whether the Canadian military is overrated, we need to examine its modern structure and capabilities. The Canadian Armed Forces consist of three main branches: the Canadian Army, the Royal Canadian Navy, and the Royal Canadian Air Force. Each has unique strengths and challenges. Let's look at them one by one. The Canadian Army is the land component. It includes both regular force and reserve force members. The Army emphasises flexibility, focusing on the ability to respond to a wide range of scenarios. These range from helping civilian authorities during natural disasters at home to combat operations overseas. Canada's army is not large by global standards, especially when you compare it to countries like the United States, China, or Russia. Yet it benefits from professional training, a strong non-commissioned officer corps, and advanced equipment for niche roles. When we look at the numbers, the regular force stands around 23,000 to 25,000 personnel, though exact figures can vary year to year. The reserve can add another 20,000 or so. That total might sound modest, but it's important to note that Canada doesn't aim to field a massive standing army. The army's focus is on technology, interoperability with allies, and specialized training. One rhetorical question might be, is a smaller force always less effective, or can well-trained, well-equipped troops stand toe-to-toe with larger militaries? The answer often depends on the nature of the mission. Next up is the Royal Canadian Navy. Canada boasts the world's longest coastline, so a robust navy makes sense from a geographic standpoint. Yet the Canadian Navy has faced modern challenges. Its surface fleet includes frigates, maritime coastal defense vessels, and soon a new fleet of Arctic and offshore patrol ships. The Canadian Navy also operates submarines, though that fleet has faced periodic mechanical issues and modernization hurdles. The Royal Canadian Navy's global presence is smaller than, say, the US Navy or the Royal Navy. Still, Canadian ships have joined international operations to protect maritime security. They've also shown their value in humanitarian missions. Given Canada's Arctic territory, there is an ongoing debate about how best to guard those northern waters. Here's a question worth asking. Does the Royal Canadian Navy's size match the demands of the world's second largest country by landmass? It often depends on who you ask, but some argue that Canada could do more to protect its Arctic interests. The Royal Canadian Air Force handles everything from fighter jets to transport aircraft to search and rescue helicopters. Canada's fleet of CF-18 fighter jets has served since the 1980s, although modernization efforts are in the works. When discussing the Royal Canadian Air Force, some critics claim Canada has lagged behind major allies in upgrading its fighter force. Others point out that the Air Force's strategic lift capabilities, thanks to planes like the C-17 Globemaster, give it an edge when supporting humanitarian and military missions around the globe. This tension leads to a central question. Is Canada's air fleet impressive enough for its obligations, or has it been neglected for too long? No discussion of whether a military is overrated can ignore money. Defense budgets shape what a force can do and how quickly it can adapt. Canada's defense spending has long hovered around or below 1.5% of its GDP. In contrast, NATO's guidelines suggests member states should aim for 2%. Some Canadians wonder if the budget is adequate. Others think more spending isn't necessary. Canada's annual defense budget has increased in recent years, but not at a rate that matches some other NATO allies. Exact figures shift over time, but it's typical to see numbers in the range of 20 to 25 billion or more, depending on the year. Critics say that if Canada wants to maintain a credible global presence and protect its vast territory, it should boost defense spending. Yet, the counterpoint is that Canada has other social priorities. Canadians often rank healthcare and education higher than defense in opinion polls. There's also a history of relying on the United States for continental defense through NORAD. As a result, some question whether massive increases would be wise or even popular with voters. Might the money be better spent on social services, infrastructure, or climate initiatives? That question sparks heated debates among policymakers and the public alike. Another angle is the return on investment. People ask, are we getting our money's worth from the Canadian forces? Defense spending doesn't always show immediate, tangible results, especially if the country is not at war. But the argument can flip. Is it better to have a well-funded deterrent that you never have to use, or a smaller force that might struggle when called upon? Supporters of increased funding argue that Canada's strategic environment is changing. The Arctic is opening up to new shipping lanes. Russia has shown renewed interest in Arctic sovereignty. Tensions with great powers might escalate, and climate change could bring more natural disasters to which the Canadian forces would have to respond. All of this suggests that a stronger defense capacity might be wise. On the other hand, critics maintain that Canada can fulfill its needs with its current budget. especially if the focus remains on specialized tasks and allied cooperation. The core question here is about image. To assess that, we need to consider how people view Canada's military, both at home and abroad. Is it thought of as a peacekeeping superpower? As an underfunded sidekick to the US? As a modest yet professional force? Canada's reputation as a leader in peacekeeping missions dates back to Lester B. Pearson's era. For decades, Canadians have viewed their forces as global problem solvers. Media coverage often focuses on Canada's contributions to United Nations operations, but in recent years Canada's actual troop contributions to UN missions have declined. As of some recent counts, Canada's uniformed peacekeeping contributions have been in the low hundreds, far below past levels. Meanwhile, countries like Bangladesh, Ethiopia and Rwanda consistently contribute larger numbers to UN missions. This gap between Canada's peacekeeping image and the actual numbers on the ground causes confusion. Many Canadians still think of their forces as being at the forefront of peacekeeping efforts. Others who look at the data see that Canada has shifted its priorities away from large-scale peacekeeping. So one could argue the Canadian military is overrated if people believe it leads global peacekeeping, while in practice it doesn't deploy as many troops as expected. But then there's the comparison game. Some Canadians measure their forces against the American military, which is a tall order. With the world's largest defense budget and a vast global presence, the US dwarfs Canada in raw power. Other allies, like the United Kingdom or France, also maintain larger and more robust armed forces than Canada. Does that mean Canada's military is overrated if it doesn't compare in size? Not necessarily. The reality is that each country has different strategic goals. Canada doesn't aim for the same global reach as the US. Still, Canada punches above its weight in certain niches. For example, Canadian snipers have set distance records for long-range engagements. Canadian Special Operations Forces, like Joint Task Force 2, are respected in the Special Forces community. In international exercises, Canadian troops often receive praise for their professionalism. These details might surprise people who think Canada's military is too small to matter. In popular culture, the Canadian forces don't enjoy the same spotlight as, say, the US Marine Corps does in Hollywood. That can skew perceptions. Few big-budget movies or TV series highlight Canadian operations in the same way. As a result, some folks outside Canada barely register the country's military at all. When coverage does appear, it might emphasize the friendly Canadian stereotype or show humanitarian aid missions after hurricanes in the Caribbean. That might lead some viewers to see the Canadian forces as soft or specialized only in non-combat tasks. On the flip side, Canadians with a strong sense of national pride might be quick to point to historical victories and the country's unwavering commitment to NATO. They might recall how Canada sent troops to Afghanistan soon after 9/11 and took part in real combat against insurgents. Again, the question is, does the gap between different portrayals mean the Canadian military is rated more highly or more lowly than it deserves? It's hard to talk about the Canadian military without mentioning alliances. Two key partnerships come to mind, NORAD and NATO. Both shape the Canadian forces in fundamental ways. NORAD is a joint US-Canada initiative to monitor and defend North American airspace. Canada contributes fighter jets, radar stations, and personnel, but the United States carries the bulk of the costs and responsibilities because of its size and resources. This arrangement sometimes causes critics to say Canada free rides on US defense. Does that make the Canadian military overrated if it depends so heavily on a larger partner? Or is it a logical approach for a smaller nation that shares a continent with a superpower? From Canada's perspective, NORAD is vital. It gives Canada a seat at the table for decisions about North American air defense. But it also creates a relationship where critics might see Canada as punching below its weight. Others argue that Canada brings unique expertise to Arctic surveillance, and that Canadian territory is crucial to the defense of the entire continent. Without Canada, the US would face even bigger challenges monitoring the northern approaches. Canada was a founding member of NATO in 1949. It has stood alongside allies in Korea, the Balkans, Libya, and Afghanistan under various international coalitions. NATO sets expectations for burden sharing, including that 2% GDP defense spending guideline. Canada remains below that mark, which some officials in Washington, D.C. have criticized. Still, it's common to hear that Canada is pulling its weight in other ways, like providing specialized training, transport, or leadership in certain missions. For instance, Canada led a NATO battle group in Latvia as part of the alliance's deterrence mission against Russian aggression. These roles highlight that Canada isn't shy about contributing forces to NATO, but the question remains, does Canada's readiness to lead small but important missions balance out a budget that's lower than NATO's recommendation? If you believe Canada fulfills its commitments through quality, then you might see it as underrated. If you place heavy emphasis on spending, you might see it as overrated or undercommitted. To get a fair view, we should look at times when the Canadian forces acted decisively. If we see consistent excellence in certain areas, that might hint Canada is underrated. If we see occasional successes overshadowed by many gaps, that might point the other way. One of the largest Canadian military deployments in recent history was in Afghanistan. Starting in 2001, Canadian troops were part of the international coalition. By the mid-2000s, Canada took on the lead in the Kandahar region, which saw heavy fighting. Many soldiers faced roadside bombs and ambushes. The casualties Canada suffered were significant for the size of the force deployed. Over the years, about 159 Canadian military personnel died in that theatre, a heavy toll for a small country. Despite the hardships, Canada's military adapted. They contributed to security operations, worked with local communities, and helped train Afghan security forces. The mission also tested Canada's logistical and combat capabilities. For many observers, the performance of Canadian troops under these conditions was admirable. It showed that Canada could operate in a tough environment, not just in peacekeeping or humanitarian missions. Canada's Navy has joined anti-piracy missions off the coast of Somalia. Canadian ships also helped with sanctions enforcement against rogue states. They've been part of multinational task forces that ensure safe shipping lanes. These contributions may not grab headlines, but they matter a great deal to global commerce. If Canada's Navy was purely symbolic, it wouldn't be able to integrate so seamlessly with allied navies. Yet it does, proving at least some level of capability that might surprise those who dismiss Canada's maritime power. A part of the Canadian Forces' role that often goes overlooked is domestic disaster response. When floods, forest fires, or ice storms strike, Canada's military can deploy on short notice to help local authorities. This might involve evacuations, sandbagging, or delivering critical supplies. While not as flashy as overseas combat, these operations show the armed forces' value to Canadian society. Are they overrated if they spend significant time helping their own citizens, or is that an essential part of modern military duties? Now, let's address criticisms levelled against the Canadian forces. If we ignore challenges, we won't get the full picture. Some argue that Canada's procurement system is broken, leading to delays and cost overruns. Others claim morale suffers due to underfunding and slow bureaucratic processes. And still others worry about Canada's ability to protect its Arctic sovereignty. Mention military procurement to a Canadian, and you might hear a frustrated sigh, whether it's the CF-18 fighter replacement saga or the attempts to build new surface combatants for the Navy. Canada has had its fair share of delays. Each project tends to spark political debate over costs and priorities. That results in a drawn-out process that can leave the forces stuck with aging equipment. If your jets are older than the pilots flying them, is that a sign of an overrated military? The problem isn't unique to Canada, but it's more visible given the smaller scale. Each new ship or plane is a big deal, and when programs see repeated delays, the negative effects become clear quickly. Critics say if Canada were truly a leading military power, it would streamline these processes. Supporters claim that democratic oversight and complex checks and balances result in slower decisions, but better accountability. Recruiting and retaining personnel can be a hurdle. When the private sector offers competitive salaries and fewer hardships, it's tough to attract new recruits. Some Canadians see little appeal in military life, which might contribute to recruitment shortfalls. This leads to the question, if the country's own youth aren't lining up to join, Does that speak to an overrated perception of the forces, or does it reflect a changing culture where fewer individuals see the military as their calling? Canada has attempted to improve recruitment, including efforts to reach out to diverse communities. The forces also emphasize education benefits, skills training, and travel opportunities. Yet, in a highly urbanized and peaceful society, the lure of the uniform isn't always strong. This is not unique to Canada, but it does shape perceptions of the force's future capabilities. Canada's Arctic is a vast region that's thawing faster every year. With more navigation routes opening up, foreign vessels might challenge Canadian claims. Russia, the US, and others have interests in the region. Ensuring Canada's presence in that remote part of the country is expensive and logistically complex. Some worry Canada doesn't have enough icebreakers or patrol ships to safeguard those waters. Meanwhile, the Canadian Rangers, a mostly Indigenous reserve unit, provide some level of ground presence. They use snowmobiles and rifles to patrol the northern tundra. But is that enough when strategic rivals might bring nuclear-powered submarines or advanced aircraft near Canadian territory? Critics say no. They argue the Canadian military is at risk of being caught off guard in the Arctic. Others point out that Canada can rely on diplomatic channels and alliances, maintaining a low-key but steady presence rather than a full military build-up. One might ask, does a failure to secure the Arctic fully mean the Canadian forces are overrated, or is it a wise choice of limited resources? At this point, you might think the Canadian forces have their fair share of problems, but there are reasons to believe they are underrated in some ways. Let's explore a few. Canadian troops often earn praise from allies for their professionalism. They train hard and adapt well in multinational exercises. Senior non-commissioned officers hold a lot of practical expertise, and Canadian junior officers learn to lead in dynamic environments. When integrated into larger coalitions, Canada's soldiers, sailors, and air personnel rarely look out of place. This standard of professionalism doesn't come cheap or easy. It's a testament to Canada's approach to training, which stresses leadership development and initiative at all levels. In many alliances, Canadian military units are seen as reliable partners that get the job done. If you define overrated as being praised without merit, then maybe that label doesn't apply here. The Canadian Forces' reputation for skill seems backed up by real-world performance. Joint Task Force 2, the Canadian Special Operations Regiment, and other special operations units maintain a quiet but potent presence. JTF-2 has served in operations around the globe, often in coordination with US and British Special Forces. Though details are classified, reports of successful missions against high-value targets suggest an elite capability that doesn't always make headlines. Some argue these special operations units are among the best in the world. That wouldn't suggest an overrated force, but rather one that's underpublicized. Peacekeeping, counterinsurgency, disaster relief, Arctic patrols, Canada's military does a bit of everything. That adaptability can be an asset. In a world where threats vary widely, a force that can handle a range of scenarios might be more valuable than a specialized one-mission force. Canadian troops have learned to shift between roles quickly, a skill that allies appreciate. Public opinion in Canada shapes the military's direction. A large portion of Canadians hold a favourable view of the forces. They respect the sacrifices service members make, yet they aren't always eager to invest in expensive equipment. This creates a push and pull effect in Parliament. Political leaders want to show support for the troops, but they also want to address the public's interest in social issues. One might ask, does the Canadian military suffer from being overshadowed by other concerns in the public mindset? If the public doesn't see a pressing need for a bigger or more advanced military, then the forces might remain at a certain size and capability level. That can fuel debates over whether the Canadian military is punching below its weight. But from a national perspective, if Canada's security interests are met and the public is content, does it matter if some outside observers label the military as overrated or underrated? To answer whether the Canadian military is overrated, we must also think about its future. In the next decade, Canada will likely face decisions on fighter jet replacements, new naval ships, and Arctic infrastructure. Cyber defense and space assets may also rise in priority. Will Canada choose to remain a mid-level power that focuses on niche strengths, or try to expand its capabilities across the board? Canada's strong, secure, engaged defence policy outlines a long-term plan that includes equipment upgrades, more support for personnel, and higher spending. Whether these plans become reality depends on political will and economic conditions. If the government follows through, the Canadian forces could see a major boost to their equipment, including modern fighters and frigates. That might give them a stronger global profile, challenging the idea that they're overrated. But skepticism persists. Delays in procurement have occurred in the past, and cost overruns could reduce the program's effectiveness. If the modernization lags, critics will continue to argue that Canada remains behind the curve. Could that widen the gap between the perception of Canada as a capable ally and the sometimes clunky reality of a slow-moving defence bureaucracy? The Arctic will be a key focus. As ice recedes, new shipping lanes will open. Resource competition might increase. The Canadian forces plan to deploy Arctic offshore patrol ships to assert sovereignty. But will that be enough to keep up with Russia's and China's icebreaking fleets? Or might Canada leverage alliances like the US and other NATO partners to maintain control in the far north? If Canada invests in a stronger Arctic presence, it could shift the narrative. Observers might say, look, Canada is serious about defending its turf. If it fails to do so, critics could argue the Canadian forces are unprepared, fueling the notion that the military is less potent than it appears. Robotics, drones, artificial intelligence, these technologies are changing warfare. Smaller militaries can level the playing field if they adopt advanced tech. Canada could focus on these emerging areas to stay relevant despite a smaller headcount. If Canada invests wisely, it could develop niche capabilities that punch above its weight. So, is the Canadian military overrated or not? The answer might lie in the eyes of the beholder. Some see a storied past and a capable, if modest, present. They point to Canada's dedicated troops, professional training, and record of effective coalitions. Others emphasize budget shortfalls, outdated equipment, and heavy reliance on allies. They say Canada's military image stems from past glories or well-publicized peacekeeping missions that don't match current deployments. After going through all these factors, where does the truth lie? The Canadian military may not be the global heavyweight that some Canadians imagine when they recall the heroic deeds of Vimy Ridge, B-Day, or the peacekeeping era, nor is it a paper tiger that can't operate effectively. It's a middle power force with both impressive qualities and notable limitations. What might Canada do to better align its military capabilities with the image it projects, or wants to project? One potential solution is to increase defence spending to match NATO's 2% guideline. This would allow for more modern equipment, faster procurement, and a greater ability to defend vast territories, including the Arctic. But this path demands a political consensus that might not exist, especially when public opinion leans toward social spending. Another solution is to focus on specific niches. Rather than trying to excel in every domain, Canada could invest in special operations, cyber defense, Arctic patrols, and strategic airlift. This would build on existing strengths. It would also allow Canada to remain a valuable coalition partner without stretching its resources thin. A third option is to strengthen alliances. Canada could lean even more on collaborative projects with the US and other NATO partners. Joint procurement and research could reduce costs and improve interoperability. This approach might raise the old free rider criticism, though, unless Canada contributes its fair share. In the end, the question, is the Canadian military overrated, might be less important than, is Canada's military structured and funded in a way that meets Canada's security needs and international obligations? If the public and government conclude that it is, then debates about being overrated fade in importance. If cracks begin to show, if Canada can't respond to an Arctic threat or a global crisis, then calls for reform will grow louder. For now, Canada's military stands at a crossroads. It has a proud legacy, an uncertain future, and a public that respects its troops but isn't always willing to open the purse strings. How that tension resolves will define whether the Canadian military can keep pace with a changing world, or whether it will remain caught in debates over what it once was and what it could become. And if you're still wondering whether Canada's military is overrated, underrated, or somewhere in between, well, the truth is, it depends on which lens you use. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Canada's defence landscape. I hope this exploration helps you form your own view of the Canadian forces. Their reputation might not fit neatly into a single label, but understanding the strengths, weaknesses, and choices ahead makes it easier to see why people disagree. The final verdict is up to you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like the video, share it with others who love military topics, and subscribe for more discussions about defence issues from around the globe. Thanks again, and see you next time.